By early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had secured a staggering series of victories across the Pacific. From the swift conquest of the Philippines to the occupation of the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots and sailors moved with an apparent invincibility. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter dominated the skies, and carrier-borne air power became the linchpin of Japanese strategy. Within the Japanese high command, confidence verged on hubris. They believed that by luring the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap, they could secure a decisive victory that would end American resistance in the Pacific. This was the genesis of Operation MI, the plan to capture Midway Atoll and annihilate the U.S. carriers rumored to be operating nearby. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, laid out the operation with meticulous detail. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would spearhead the assault. Their air wings, composed of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, and Zero fighters, were confident in their ability to crush any opposition. Japanese pilots trained for months on carrier strikes, bombing runs, and interception maneuvers. Yet amid the thoroughness of their preparation, one critical element remained unknown to them. American intelligence had already begun unraveling their plans. On the other side of the Pacific, U.S. Navy cryptographers at Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, were quietly piecing together Japanese communications. Through the painstaking decryption of JN-25 codes, the Americans discovered that a major Japanese operation was underway, targeting a location designated AF, later confirmed to be Midway Atoll. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, aware of the strategic stakes, prepared a calculated gamble. Though outnumbered in carriers and air power, the U.S. Pacific Fleet positioned USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to lie in wait for the approaching Japanese strike force. At Midway Atoll, Marine Corps defenders worked tirelessly to repair airfields and fortify positions. Early warning radar installations were tested and retested. Every scout plane and bomber pilot was briefed for rapid response, aware that the Japanese attack could arrive without warning. Yet morale remained high, bolstered by the knowledge that intelligence gave them an unexpected advantage. Meanwhile, American pilots, trained in SBD Dauntless dive bombers, carrier-capable and heavily armed, readied themselves for the imminent clash. They were aware that the success of the operation depended on surprise, precision, and timing, a trifecta that would soon turn the tables on their formidable opponents. Meanwhile, Japanese reconnaissance efforts were ongoing but flawed. Overconfidence led pilots to assume the Pacific skies were under their uncontested control. They anticipated minimal resistance from Midway defenders and, critically, no American carriers in the vicinity. This miscalculation would prove pivotal. Reports from Japanese scout planes failed to detect the full disposition of American naval forces, feeding a growing sense of invulnerability among the strike squadrons. By late May 1942, the stage was set. Japanese carriers steamed westward toward Midway Atoll, a formidable armada of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Every vessel carried the weight of Japanese strategic ambitions. On board the carriers, air crews performed final checks on their aircraft. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, and Zero fighters. Confidence among the pilots was high. Recent victories in the Coral Sea and the early Pacific campaigns reinforced the belief that U.S. forces were on the defensive and unprepared. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized coordinated strikes and the element of surprise. Pilots trained extensively in dive bombing attacks, carrier launches, and formation flying. The 4th Air Group, one of the primary strike units aboard Akagi, practiced repeated drills to perfect bombing runs. Despite this meticulous preparation, Japanese reconnaissance remained insufficient. Scout planes and seaplanes patrolling the Pacific failed to detect the exact location of the American carriers. Overconfidence had led the command to underestimate the possibility of an ambush. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, U.S. intelligence had already deciphered critical portions of the Japanese operational plan. Codebreakers at Station Hypo had identified Midway as the target of Operation MI, providing Admiral Chester W. Nimitz the knowledge to position Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown in ambush. The Americans understood that numerical superiority would be a challenge. They faced 4 Japanese carriers against 3, but intelligence provided the tactical advantage. Pilots aboard Enterprise and Hornet readied their SBD Dauntless dive bombers, knowing that timing, precision, and coordination would be decisive factors. The early morning of June 3rd was marked by careful U.S. reconnaissance. Submarines and scout planes ventured into the Pacific, attempting to locate the Japanese fleet. Spot reports indicated heavy traffic but remained inconclusive. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots, flying at higher altitudes and scanning the horizon for signs of American resistance, remained largely confident in their invisibility. The combination of poor reconnaissance and Japanese assumptions about American weakness would soon prove catastrophic. As the carriers approached Midway, Japanese pilots practiced last-minute drills on launch sequences. Deck crews prepared munitions, fuel, and aircraft with precision. The air wings, numbering hundreds of planes across the 4 carriers, awaited the order to strike. Commanders emphasized speed and accuracy, unaware that U.S. carrier forces lay hidden to the northeast, ready to respond with the full weight of their dive bomber squadrons. On the American side, tension ran high. Pilots and support crews aboard Enterprise and Hornet executed final maintenance checks on SBD Dauntless dive bombers, reviewing bomb loads, release altitudes, and dive angles. Training emphasized the precision of the steep dive. Pilots knew a single error could mean missing the target or being shot down. Intelligence officers monitored the movements of the Japanese fleet, continuously updating commanders with the latest intercepts. For many U.S. aviators, this would be their first real test of their skills in the Pacific theater. As dusk fell on June 3rd, the Japanese fleet was still unaware of the hidden American carriers. Scout reports, misinterpreted or incomplete, reinforced the belief that the ocean ahead was free of enemy forces. Pilots relaxed slightly, confident that Midway's defenses would be their only real obstacle. Fuel, munitions, and morale were at their peak. The fleet moved with the precision of a machine well-oiled through months of preparation. Yet the seeds of surprise had been planted. While Japanese pilots trained, American forces prepared. The SBD Dauntless squadrons would be ready to exploit the Japanese overconfidence, their dive bombers capable of delivering destruction with pinpoint accuracy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge every assumption held by Japanese naval aviators. By the morning of June 4th, the Pacific skies would erupt in a battle that no Japanese pilot, trained, confident, and skilled, could have fully anticipated. The first light of June 4, 1942, revealed a quiet but tense Pacific horizon. Midway Atoll, though small, was bristling with U.S. defenses. Radar installations and lookout posts scanned the ocean, while Marine Corps anti-aircraft gunners positioned themselves along the atoll's limited coastline. For the Japanese, the day began with an air of unshakable confidence. From the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, hundreds of aircraft prepared for the first wave of strikes against Midway, oblivious to the hidden threat that lay to the northeast. At 0445 hours, Japanese scout planes located Midway, confirming the atoll's presence and the approximate locations of defensive positions. The first strike, composed of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers escorted by Mitsubishi Zero fighters, launched from the carriers. These pilots had trained for months for this exact scenario, a rapid assault on a lightly defended target with minimal risk from enemy interceptors. They carried bombs calibrated for Midway's airfields and key infrastructure, expecting little resistance beyond the small contingent of Marine aircraft. The defenders of Midway, however, had been preparing for weeks. Although outnumbered, they had an advantage in early warning systems, foreknowledge from U.S. intelligence, and well-drilled anti-aircraft crews. Radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formations, and alarms sounded across the atoll. Marine pilots scrambled in outdated aircraft, including F-4F Wildcats, to intercept the approaching VALs and their escorts. Bombs began falling on Midway's runways and installations, and fires erupted in scattered areas. Despite heavy damage to some facilities, defenders remained operational, repositioning planes and equipment wherever possible. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots proceeded under the assumption that their domination of the skies was absolute. The Zero escorts, confident in their air superiority, engaged in routine patrols and minor dogfights with Marine fighters. Few suspected that the most dangerous threat, the U.S. carriers and their Dauntless dive bombers, was lying hidden to the northeast, ready to respond with the full weight of their dive bomber squadrons. From the decks of USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, U.S. air crews received the order to launch strike groups against the Japanese carriers. Squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, each armed with 1,000-pound bombs, took to the skies. Pilots checked altimeters and bomb release mechanisms, focusing on timing and precision. Their mission was clear: locate the Japanese fleet and deliver a sudden, concentrated strike. For these aviators, the challenge was immense. Unlike the Japanese, who flew from familiar carriers with established navigational routines, U.S. pilots relied on estimated positions and careful coordination. Any mistake could mean failure or death. As the morning progressed, Japanese air crews concentrated on Midway, oblivious to the American carriers maneuvering into attack positions. Scout planes, sent to locate enemy ships, reported nothing of significance. The Japanese overconfidence, born of recent victories and reinforced by incomplete intelligence, blinded them to the strategic reality. Their carriers were now vulnerable to a surprise assault. By mid-morning, Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were climbing to attack altitude. Japanese decks were crowded with planes rearming and refueling after the first strike. Commanders aboard Akagi and Kaga believed they had neutralized the Midway airfields and that the worst of the danger had passed. Few aboard anticipated that American dive bombers, unseen and unopposed at this point, were converging overhead, ready to strike with deadly accuracy. The stage was set for the confrontation that would alter the course of the Pacific War. Japanese pilots, trained, confident, and battle-hardened, remained focused on Midway itself, never suspecting that the SBD Dauntless dive bombers were moments away from finding them at their most vulnerable moment. The morning calm masked a looming disaster that would test the limits of every pilot, sailor, and deckhand on both sides. By late morning on June 4, 1942, the Japanese fleet, confident and unchallenged, steamed in formation to the northwest of Midway. Carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu bristled with aircraft on deck. Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers, many returning from the earlier Midway strike, were being refueled and rearmed. The crews operated with precision and speed, unaware that the calm ocean would soon become the stage for a sudden and devastating assault. At 10:20 hours, from the decks of USS Enterprise and Yorktown, squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers climbed into the sky. Each plane carried a single 1,000-pound bomb, and a pilot focused on exacting precision. Navigators guided the formations toward the last known positions of the Japanese carriers, relying on intelligence, scout reports, and careful calculations. For many U.S. pilots, this would be the first opportunity to strike the carriers that had dominated the Pacific in the months following Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, still concentrating on the Midway Atoll defenses, were oblivious to the incoming threat. Scout planes patrolled the surrounding ocean, but visibility was limited and their reports inconclusive. Many Japanese pilots believed that any American naval presence had been neutralized or was too distant to matter. This overconfidence proved catastrophic. At precisely the right moment, the SBD Dauntless dive bomber squadrons emerged from the clouds, diving steeply toward their targets. The American approach was perfectly timed. Japanese decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and armed, providing an ideal target. As the first Dauntless planes began their dives, anti-aircraft gunners aboard Akagi and Kaga scrambled to respond. Shrapnel and tracer fire streaked into the sky, but the steep diving angles of the Dauntless made them difficult targets. Pilots adjusted their dive paths with exacting precision, releasing bombs at altitudes of just 1,500 feet. The first impact struck the flight deck of Kaga, igniting fuel and ordnance. Fires spread rapidly, and secondary explosions erupted as bombs detonated in the hangars below. Simultaneously, Akagi suffered a near-identical fate. A Dauntless bomb penetrated the deck, igniting a chain reaction among parked aircraft. Smoke and flames obscured the carrier's silhouette, and deck crews struggled desperately to contain the inferno. Japanese pilots watching from the air were stunned. They had trained for coordinated attacks, expecting resistance only from defending fighters or minor anti-aircraft fire, not the sudden precision of American dive bombers finding them in mid-ocean. Zero fighters scrambled from the decks, attempting to intercept the Dauntless formations. Yet the American planes were already in the steepest portion of their dives, too fast and focused to be easily engaged. The psychological impact on Japanese air crews was profound. Their assumed dominance of the skies was challenged in an instant. Many watched helplessly as bombs tore through their carriers, realizing that the U.S. Navy had positioned dive bombers with unanticipated timing and accuracy. Within minutes, both Akagi and Kaga were heavily damaged, burning uncontrollably. Fires spread to fuel stores and ordnance magazines, making firefighting nearly impossible. Crewmen risked their lives attempting to save the ships, but the weight of destruction was overwhelming. Japanese commanders, initially stunned, attempted to coordinate a counterattack, but confusion and communication breakdowns hampered any organized response. The first clash had ended in a decisive display of surprise and precision. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers, small, slow compared to Japanese fighters, but extraordinarily accurate, had achieved what Japanese pilots never expected. Their carriers, symbols of Japan's naval power, were suddenly vulnerable, exposed to destruction in a way the Japanese High Command had never anticipated. The morning of June 4 had rewritten the rules of engagement over the Pacific, proving that intelligence, timing, and tactical innovation could overcome superior numbers and long-established confidence. The aftermath of the morning strikes left the Japanese fleet in turmoil. By mid-morning on June 4, 1942, Akagi and Kaga were engulfed in towering columns of smoke, their decks transformed into infernos of burning aircraft, fuel, and munitions. Fires spread unchecked, fed by bomb fragments and ruptured fuel lines. Crewmen scrambled desperately to fight the flames, but chaos reigned. Hose lines snapped under the heat, and firefighting teams were overwhelmed by secondary explosions from bombs and torpedoes still aboard the carriers. Japanese pilots in the air, observing from their Zeros, were struck by a sense of disbelief. Their carefully rehearsed training did not prepare them for the precision and timing of the SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Many had assumed that the U.S. carriers were either destroyed or too distant to matter. This instant added to a sense of disbelief, and Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers, already refueling and rearming, were unable to take off from the destroyed decks.
Pilots attempted emergency takeoffs, but many aircraft were destroyed before reaching the edge of the deck. Meanwhile, Soryu and Hiryu, still intact, scrambled fighters to intercept the American dive bombers. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, but the steep dive paths and rapid bomb release of the Dauntless made targeting extremely difficult. From the American perspective, the coordination and bravery of the pilots was remarkable. They dove from altitudes of over 15,000 feet, released bombs at precise points, and then pulled out under the withering fire of Japanese gunners. The resulting devastation demonstrated the lethal combination of surprise, precision, and timing, a combination the Japanese had never anticipated. The Japanese command structures strained under the pressure. Messages sent between carriers were delayed or lost amid the chaos. Admiral Nagumo aboard Akagi attempted to coordinate a counterstrike, but confusion and uncertainty hampered efforts. Many officers debated whether to launch a second wave against Midway or attempt immediate defensive measures, while the burning carriers signaled an urgent need for damage control. The well-oiled machine of Japanese naval aviation was suddenly fragmented, with order replaced by reactive improvisation. Despite the destruction, Japanese pilots attempted retaliatory strikes. Hiryu launched a counterattack later in the morning, sending dive bombers and torpedo planes toward USS Yorktown. This raid demonstrated their resilience and tactical skill, but by this point, the initiative had shifted. American dive bomber squadrons were already regrouping, and the Japanese were forced onto the defensive. The tide of battle had turned, revealing a vulnerability in the Japanese operational planning. Overconfidence had blinded them to the possibility of a hidden threat capable of exploiting precisely that weakness. By noon, the smoke from Akagi and Kaga had become visible for miles. Fires raged uncontrollably, and both carriers were effectively lost. Japanese pilots, previously confident in their supremacy, now faced the reality of sudden vulnerability. The impact of the Dauntless dive bombers went beyond the physical destruction. It shattered morale, exposed critical flaws in Japanese reconnaissance, and underscored the deadly consequences of underestimating an intelligent and prepared adversary. In the chaos, a new lesson emerged. Precision, timing, and daring could overcome even the most seasoned pilots in formidable fleets. Japanese aviators had never expected such a coordinated, sudden strike, and the consequences would reverberate through the remainder of the Pacific campaign. By early afternoon on June 4, 1942, the Japanese fleet situation had deteriorated dramatically. Akagi and Kaga were burning uncontrollably, their decks shattered and hangars engulfed in flames. Smoke and debris created a grim tableau for the remaining carriers, Soryu and Hiryu, whose crews scrambled to regroup while simultaneously launching counterstrikes against the U.S. forces. Yet the precision and timing of the SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown would soon shift the balance irrevocably. The American strike groups, having reassembled after the morning attacks, climbed to operational altitude and set their sights on Soryu and Hiryu. Pilots relied on carefully calculated headings, intelligence reports, and navigational estimates to locate the remaining carriers. The afternoon sun glinted off the Japanese fleet, revealing decks crowded with aircraft preparing for another Midway assault. For many Japanese pilots and crewmen, the realization that the American carriers were still operational and capable of launching coordinated dive bomber attacks was a shocking revelation. At approximately 13:15 hours, the first American dive bombers began their steep dives towards Soryu. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled, firing into the descending planes, but the Dauntless squadrons executed perfect attack runs, releasing bombs from altitudes of 1,500 to 2,000 feet. The first bomb struck near the flight deck, igniting parked aircraft and ruptured fuel lines. A secondary explosion tore through the hangar, sending debris skyward and setting off nearby ordnance. Crewmen on Soryu fought valiantly to contain the fires, but chaos and destruction spread rapidly across the vessel. Simultaneously, a squadron targeted Hiryu, then the only carrier still operational among the Japanese fleet. Deck crews had been attempting to launch planes for a counterattack, unaware that American dive bombers were approaching from an unexpected angle. Bombs penetrated the flight deck, igniting fuel stores and parked aircraft. Fires raged uncontrollably, overwhelming firefighting teams and spreading to ammunition magazines. Hiryu, a symbol of Japanese resilience after the loss of Akagi and Kaga, was now also critically endangered. Japanese pilots, many of whom had survived earlier attacks, attempted to intercept the incoming Dauntless planes. Zeros engaged in frantic dogfights, but the American dive bombers' steep attack angles and precise timing rendered defensive maneuvers largely ineffective. The element of surprise, coupled with meticulous execution, proved devastating. Japanese aviators witnessed the rapid destruction of their carriers and realized that the tide of the battle had decisively turned against them. By mid-afternoon, Soryu was ablaze, listing heavily as fires consumed its flight deck and hangars. Hiryu, though temporarily able to launch some aircraft, could not withstand the relentless American assaults. Additional Dauntless strikes struck with pinpoint accuracy, igniting fuel lines and causing secondary explosions. Japanese commanders on board Hiryu struggled to maintain situational awareness amid the smoke and chaos. By 1700 hours, both Soryu and Hiryu were effectively lost, either sinking or incapacitated, leaving the Japanese fleet without its carrier air power.
For the Japanese, the psychological impact was as significant as the physical devastation. Experienced pilots were lost, carrier decks destroyed, and morale shattered. Meanwhile, U.S. pilots and crews, exhausted but resolute, had achieved a victory against overwhelming odds. The battle demonstrated that tactical innovation, careful planning, and precise execution could overcome numerical superiority and long-established assumptions about enemy dominance. By sunset, the Japanese fleet, stripped of its carriers, began a retreat. The Americans, though damaged, had secured a decisive victory, forever altering the course of the Pacific War. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers, small and slow compared to Japanese fighters, had proven lethal when employed with precision and timing. In a single day, the assumptions of Japanese pilots that American naval air power was weak, slow, and uncoordinated had been shattered. As dusk settled over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the remnants of the Japanese fleet began a cautious retreat toward the north and west. The four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been effectively neutralized. Fires consumed Akagi and Kaga, forcing crews to abandon ship. Soryu and Hiryu, heavily damaged, would later succumb to American attacks or scuttling. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed, and experienced pilots, many irreplaceable, were lost in the carnage. The psychological blow was profound. The Japanese had overestimated their invulnerability and underestimated the effectiveness of American intelligence and dive bomber precision. Across the fleet, survivors struggled with the enormity of the loss. Sailors and officers recounted the chaos on deck, the rapid spread of fire, secondary explosions, and the terror of watching the carriers, once symbols of national power, reduced to burning hulks. Damage control teams, though trained and courageous, had been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of destruction. Many Japanese pilots, unable to return to their carriers, ditched at sea, clinging to life rafts or awaiting rescue. Post-war interrogations revealed a recurring sentiment among the survivors: disbelief at how suddenly and decisively the battle had turned. The Americans, though not unscathed, had secured a pivotal victory. USS Yorktown, damaged by a Hiryu counterstrike earlier in the day, remained afloat, while Enterprise and Hornet emerged largely unscathed. Dauntless pilots had executed dive-bombing runs with extraordinary accuracy, exploiting the brief moments when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, crowded with refueling aircraft and ordnance. The combination of timing, planning, and daring overcame the numerical superiority and tactical skill of the Japanese fleet. For the U.S., the victory marked a turning point in the Pacific, bolstering morale and proving that intelligence-driven strategy could counter an experienced and battle-hardened adversary. American pilots and commanders recognized the significance of the engagement. Post-battle debriefings highlighted the extraordinary skill of the Dauntless pilots, whose ability to deliver bombs with pinpoint accuracy changed the course of the conflict. From the carrier decks, commanders noted that daring maneuvers and exact timing were as lethal as raw power fire. The coordination of intelligence, reconnaissance, and dive bomber execution became a case study for naval aviation strategy. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced a crisis of morale. The confidence of veteran pilots, long a cornerstone of carrier operations, was shaken. Commanders analyzed the failures: insufficient reconnaissance, overconfidence in prior victories, and an underestimation of American capacity for surprise and coordination. Post-war memoirs and interrogation reports confirmed that many pilots had never expected U.S. forces to position carriers so strategically and deliver attacks with such precision. The losses at Midway would haunt the Japanese Navy for the remainder of the Pacific campaign, forcing adaptations in training, reconnaissance, and carrier doctrine. By nightfall, the immediate battle was over, but the implications of Midway resonated far beyond the Pacific horizon. The Americans had not only survived, but achieved a decisive victory against overwhelming odds. The Japanese carriers, once instruments of power projection, were largely destroyed, their crews traumatized and their strategy in disarray. The element of surprise and the effectiveness of SBD Dauntless dive bombers had redefined naval warfare. Midway would stand as a testament to the power of intelligence, timing, and tactical innovation, proof that even the most confident adversaries could be undone by daring and precise action. In the weeks and months following the Battle of Midway, the significance of the engagement became increasingly clear. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers, small and slow compared to the nimble Mitsubishi Zero fighters, had emerged as the decisive factor in the battle. Their precise bombing runs against Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had inflicted catastrophic damage in a matter of minutes, turning what could have been another Japanese triumph into a pivotal American victory. For the U.S. Navy, the battle validated a doctrine that combined intelligence, coordination, and daring tactics, a formula that would be replicated across the Pacific theater. The immediate impact was strategic. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, along with hundreds of aircraft and seasoned pilots, were lost. The blow to Japanese naval aviation was profound. Replacement pilots lacked the experience of their predecessors, and the loss of carriers constrained Japan's ability to project air power. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. The United States, though still numerically inferior in many respects, now possessed the ability to dictate the tempo of naval operations. Midway proved that superior planning, intelligence, and tactical execution could overcome raw numbers and initial confidence.
For the American pilots, the battle became a defining moment in their careers. Many had trained for months in carrier-based operations, but the real test had come under conditions of extreme risk. The Dauntless dive bombers, piloted with courage and precision, demonstrated that careful planning, accurate navigation, and split-second timing could turn vulnerability into strength. Reports from survivors emphasized the importance of the dive bombers' steep attack angle, which allowed pilots to evade defensive fire while striking directly at critical points on the carriers. These lessons would inform subsequent campaigns, influencing training, tactics, and naval doctrine throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The Japanese pilots, on the other hand, faced a reckoning. Interrogations and post-war memoirs revealed a mixture of shock, disbelief, and respect for the American dive bombers. They had never anticipated that the U.S. Navy could position carriers so strategically, launch attacks with such precision, and exploit every weakness in timing and positioning. Midway exposed vulnerabilities in Japanese reconnaissance, overconfidence in prior victories, and assumptions that the Americans were incapable of surprise. For many, the battle marked the end of the illusion of invincibility that had defined Japanese naval aviation in the early months of the war. Beyond strategy and tactics, Midway had a profound psychological impact on both sides. American morale surged, and the victory galvanized public confidence in the Navy's ability to challenge Japanese dominance. Japanese morale suffered a severe blow, forcing the Imperial Navy to reevaluate carrier doctrine, pilot training, and fleet coordination. The battle became a symbol of the critical importance of intelligence, timing, and innovation in modern warfare. Historically, the legacy of the SBD Dauntless endures not merely in the destruction it wrought, but in the way it reshaped naval aviation strategy. Pilots, commanders, and historians alike recognize that a relatively slow dive bomber, deployed with intelligence, courage, and precision, could decisively influence the outcome of a major naval engagement. Midway demonstrated that technological superiority alone was insufficient. Innovation, daring execution, and adaptability could redefine the battlefield. As the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the lessons of Midway resonated far beyond the immediate losses and victories. Japanese pilots had underestimated the impact of carefully timed and coordinated dive bomber attacks, and American forces had demonstrated that strategic foresight, intelligence, and bravery could turn the tide of war. In the end, the SBD Dauntless,
unassuming yet deadly, had not only secured a decisive victory, but had forever changed the way naval warfare was conducted. Midway would stand as a testament to the power of precision, courage, and the element of surprise, proving that even the most confident adversaries could be undone by innovation and audacity.